Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. My name is James Sorensen. This is my 1931 Ford Model A Coupe. It has a brand new Burtz Model A engine block installed that now has 1,500 miles. I built this engine myself here in this very garage. This video is going to kind of go over that process of when I received the engine, my first unboxing, kind of setting my eyes on it for the very first time, my initial impressions. I'd hoped to make a full video series of the build, documenting the entire process from installing the crankshaft, installing the Burtz camshaft, all of that process. Unfortunately, my GoPro and other plans, I lost the vast majority of that footage. So this is kind of what I was able to recover, some of my initial impressions, some of my first thoughts over that. It also includes my very first startup and a couple of the starts shortly thereafterwards where you get to see it running for the very first time. I've now got 1,500 miles on this thing. I just got back from Model 8 days at the Gilmore Car Museum. It has treated me absolutely phenomenally. So without further delay, here's that unboxing. I did lose the audio files for these clips here, so you'll have to bear with me as I voice over. One of the first things I did when I got everything was just checked it over for damage. I had to unbox the rods. They came in a cardboard box. The crankshaft was actually lost. The shipper, for some reason, misplaced it. Thankfully, it said crankshaft, as you can see on the side of the box in really large letters, which made finding it a bit easier. Everything does come on a pallet, which I should turn around right here and show you. In my case, they were not banded down. They were just kind of loosely wrapped in that plastic wrap holding them down there. One of the first things I did check after just making sure things weren't damaged was I was just glancing over the rods. You can see that they are individually numbered, both the rod and the cap, which makes it pretty easy if you do take the caps off to make sure that you then line it back up with the appropriate rod. I did check a couple of them just to make sure that they were individually numbered. I was quickly just looking over them, checking to see what kind of effort was going to be involved in deburring these things, just kind of glancing over the machine work. Everything looked pretty good. I didn't really notice like any external edges that were extremely sharp, anything that just really stood out to me. I was kind of just feeling the edges through the plastic here really quickly, and everything seemed pretty comparative to what you'd find if you just ordered a rod anywhere else. There was just nothing that really stood out. Later on, I did remove the caps. There was just a little bit of filing and a little bit of metal that had kind of worked its way over the tang where the bearing sits. That required just a little bit of filing, a little bit of cleanup, but not bad at all. I did notice though that my the nuts on these were torqued considerably beyond what the manufacturer spec was. It took quite a bit of effort to get these things broken free initially, but I was pretty impressed overall. I thought there was going to be a lot more work involved on these rods, cleaning them up. I was also pretty impressed with the packaging on these. The boxes that they come in are pretty durable. It would take a good bit of effort for the shipper to destroy or damage these. They're also packaged pretty well inside of them. But yeah, I'm just pointing out how it's marked on the side crankshaft, which I did have to tell the shippers multiple times, but as you can see here as I open it up, the crank is actually wrapped in a wax paper, which kind of seals everything inside, and once I pull it open, that'll make a little bit more sense. Be prepared, it does smell pretty bad. Alright, there's the first glance at the crank as I was opening it up, and the first thing that obviously hit me was the smell. It's covered in a very heavy cosmoline type oil, anti-rust, whatever you want to call it. It is heavy, it is thick, and it smells. And I mean, it is on there. As you can see, just as I'm kind of quickly looking around at everything, you can just see how thick it is in certain places, and it is pretty durable. That stuff does not want to come off. As you can see, each one of the little red plugs in there will need to eventually come out. They just come pre-plugged as it's shipped. Those can be a bit of a pain to come out. A lot of people will use just like a wood screw, screw it in there, then grab it with some pliers and pop it out that way. I have seen some people make some specialized tools by epoxying a screw to a driver and using that to pull them out, but I believe in my case I just used a pair of needle nose pliers, if I remember right, and was able to just pull them out that way without scoring or damaging the surface. As I was just looking over the crank, I mean, everything looked really nice to me. It looked really well finished. Everything looked very, very, very smooth as far as the bearing surfaces go. I was just quickly kind of glancing over the counterweights, stuff like that. Everything looks really well finished. So here I kind of pulled it out of the box so you could get a little bit better of a view of it. Again, as you can see, it has a very, very heavy coating of that cosmoline or whatever it is that they actually use. I was just kind of looking at the bottom there where some of the wax paper actually kind of stuck to it. One of the big things that did jump out at me right away when I was looking at this was the rather large surface on the rear of the crank, which is where the rear main seal actually rides now. Just seeing how big it was compared to what I was expecting. At first it was a bit of a surprise to me, but when you end up putting it in the engine and seeing how the rear cap is designed and how that rear main seal sits in there, it makes sense how large it is like that. I did end up taking this crankshaft to the local machine shop to have them clean it for me, and they ran it through their tank twice, and even afterwards there was still a little bit in some places where that had kind of gotten really thick as it dripped off, but I did have them check the balance on it and it came out nearly perfect straight from the factory. So overall, first impressions on the crankshaft, I was quite impressed just with the way it's packaged. The cosmoline coating on it just to make sure that these things don't rust, especially since they're going to be shipped over on a boat. It may take a while before it actually gets to the warehouse and then reaches you, but they are really shipped with that in mind, so I was pretty impressed with that. So here's the moment probably everyone has been waiting for. This is where I'm about to unbox the block for the very first time, and the crate that it's shipped in is very well packaged. It's nailed together. As you can see, it has metal bandings on all the corners to hold it together to make sure it doesn't break open. It is designed pretty well, especially for how bad some of these local last mile shippers can be. As I already mentioned, I had quite the number of issues with mine. But it did arrive all in one piece without damage, but here I am just kind of looking over the box, about to pull it open for the very first time. Trying not to destroy it too badly. It was so nice I might want to reuse this box down the road. So as you'll see, right on top of the box is, at first I thought this was the builder's guide, but it's more of just an abbreviated guide that just kind of goes over what's included, some of the basics of the block. I highly recommend if you're building these that you do not just rely on this, that you do go to the website and actually find the full builder's guide. It goes just into much more detail, much further in depth, and it is updated pretty frequently if there's any kind of nuances or issues that are discovered. It'll kind of make you aware of those things, so I highly recommend checking the website very, very frequently. So here I pull out the hardware kit that comes with it. You can see the thrust bearings there at the top, you can see the studs that come with that replace the temporary studs that were installed for the original machining work. You can see all the plugs there as well at the top. It does also come with, I believe there's some extra nuts there for the studs for torquing those down on the bottom. I believe those are 12 point on the bottom. But yeah, the block itself comes wrapped, as you can see, in this plastic wrap and had a very, very, very light coating of oil on it. It was not that cosmoline stuff that was on the crank. So again, I was just checking the hardware, and okay, here I have it actually unboxed and on the counter so you can kind of get a look at it. And as you can see, they kind of have it just sitting in the box with a little bit of foam on the bottom, and it fits so tightly in there that there's a tiny bit of movement, but not enough that it's going to do any kind of damage to it. One of the first things I started kind of looking at was just how dirty it was. As you can see here, as I start looking in the back, you can see exactly why they really harp on getting these cleaned and having it professionally cleaned. There's an extreme amount of metal debris floating around in these things. Both chips, shavings, cutting fluid. There's quite a bit. You'll see this later as I pull off some of the caps, but again, I'm just kind of going through, checking over what kind of effort's going to be required here for me to deburr this thing, and I was actually quite surprised. Most of these sharp machined edges were actually not that bad. They were fairly smooth. There were a couple of them that were pretty sharp, but for the most part I was able to just come along with the regular deburr tool and get most of this. Here I am checking those inside holes through the valve cover, or the valve galley, into the crankcase area. There's a little bit of casting flash there that some people do grind out and smooth out. On mine it wasn't terrible. I was checking for burrs in the lifter pockets there just to see how smooth those were, if there was anything in those to catch. They were pretty smooth. I think I just was able to clean those up with just a fine piece of sandpaper for those bores. For the exterior and most of the exterior edges, I just used a simple deburring tool for most of it, and then came back with a fine piece of sandpaper as well. One of the first things that stood out to me was the texture as well. The texture really, really does match the original. I mean, if you go out and feel an original block and then feel the Burtz block, they feel the exact same. So one of the other things I was doing was just looking for different casting marks that might stand out to help distinguish a Burtz block from, say, an original block. So that was one of the things I was just kind of peeking around through here, was to see what kind of things give this away. And for the most part, I didn't really find that many differences, at least compared to my original block. Here on the front, I might show it again a little bit later, I did find one casting spot that was a little more pronounced on the Burtz block than it was on my original. But they both do exist. It'd be really hard for you to tell them apart just based on that difference alone. So here I am pulling it forward so you can kind of see right there, right where I'm feeling is where it just stood out ever so slightly to me, that the casting mark there was just a little larger than my block. But I had looked at a couple of others and noticed that theirs looked a bit more pronounced than mine as well. So I don't think anybody's going to notice that, or anybody's going to just jump to that conclusion immediately, being like, hey, this casting is too pronounced. This gives it away that it's a Burtz block. Other than that, one of the only other giveaways that I could think of would be if you had a mirror once the car is assembled, to be able to look in the back for the oil galley plug in the rear. I think I actually went to my car here to kind of check under the hood and see, just for comparison purposes, but it was not quite as bad as I thought. At first I was under the impression that that casting didn't exist. It, for some reason, just didn't stick in my mind, so that's why I was drawn to it right away. But once I did look at my engine and took a peek at it, it was present, just again, like I said, not quite as defined. So there I am, just kind of feeling the heights of them, just comparing these to see just how close this casting was to my block. And my block is a late 31, I believe it was. It's been a while since I pulled up the actual date, but it is a numbers matching block to the frame, so I was a bit disappointed that I was going to have to pull it out. But the center babbitt on it had gone, and it was just time to go a different route. So I apologize a bit for the shaky camera here. I don't remember if I was getting tangled up in the cord or what I was doing at this point. Okay, so there we go. Now you can kind of see the front oil galley ports a little bit that I was just looking at. You can see the oil port there that oils the cam on the thrust surface to the cam. Again, I was just kind of feeling some of the edges, checking to see what parts I'd really need to kind of work at to deburr, how much effort it was going to be to deburr all of this. I was debating on if I was going to kind of have my machine shop do that for me as well, or if I was going to take on that task, but it really wasn't that bad until the caps are pulled off. I'm not sure if you're able to see there, but it does come with all 5 cam bearings pre-installed. I did have to knock mine out to drill them because I do have the Burtz cam in this. They come set up originally for a 3 bearing camshaft. If you do buy the 5 bearing, you just have to either set up a drilling kind of block that'll fit inside the bearing to just kind of help keep your bit in place while you drill through it. You can drill through the bottom without taking them out. I tend to prefer to pop them out. Again, here I'm just checking all of the pockets for the valve guides here, checking to see if there's just any debris, if there's any kind of metal lip that I'll need to grind down or anything like that. Overall, it was a lot better than I was expecting. It really didn't take me long to kind of come through here and deburr this and smooth a lot of these edges out, to get like the lifter pockets cleaned up, to get those valve guide seats cleaned up. It was really, really simple with just basic tools. Again, another thing that stood out to me was the noticeably larger intake port design. Just looking inside them, you can see that it definitely appears to be a good bit larger inside than compared to the original Model A block. So the flow through the intakes is probably a bit improved from original. How much, I cannot say for certain, but here I'm pointing out where you can tell what your block number is, and I believe Terry described what those numbers mean. You can actually tell the exact date that your engine was born. In my case, my block is number 544, as you can see at the very end. But overall, my first impressions after just pulling it out of the box was I was pretty impressed. I thought there was going to be a lot more work to this, as far as deburring, just kind of getting the block set up and ready, but it ended up not being anywhere near the challenge that I thought. So here I have the caps removed, and you can see why cleaning on this thing is paramount. The block does come with temporary studs in both the first and the third cap. When you pull those out, you'll end up seeing quite a bit of debris comes with it, and it is absolutely paramount that you get all of that debris cleanly removed, even under some of the other caps. You'll see it as well. Here I am showing the deburr tool that I was using. I do have a stainless bit on it. I cleaned up just a couple of these edges just to see how well it would cut. and that stainless bit worked exceptionally well. It's really smoothed a lot of those edges with just a simple pass. Here I am pointing out where there was quite a bit of flashing available that I did have to kind of come through and cut out, where the studs come through the caps and they get really close to those bearings. That metal gets really thin. There was quite a bit of flashing there on both the block side and the cap itself. It was really easy to clean those up and get rid of that. But yeah, you can see there's just a really fine film of oil on the block itself that keeps it from rusting. So cleaning the block was a lot easier than cleaning that crankshaft was. Again, just checking for any kind of flashing or areas where I need to address during the deburr process. So unfortunately from this point on I did lose video footage as well, but I did take a couple of pictures along the way so you can kind of at least see what I was doing. In this picture I did have the crank and the camshaft installed. As you can see, I have all the gears installed on the front of the block as well. All the caps and the journals were installed at this point. I don't believe they were torqued down just yet. But I did check the runout on this crankshaft when I installed it using what I call the poor man's method, where you install the front bearing and the rear bearings and you set the crank in the block. And then you can rotate the crank while it's in the block and measure all of the other journals for runout. And this crank was pretty much perfectly straight. No issues that I was able to measure whatsoever. So then after that, I did put all of the caps in with plastic gauge, measured them all, and then I also went back and rotated the crank 90 degrees and did a full rotation that way, measuring it 4 times. And every time it came out as pretty much perfectly at 2/1000ths across the board. So I was very pleased with that. Everything was very consistent. In the builder's guide, it does highly suggest that you rotate the crankshaft 2 rotations every time you install a component, which was something that I did consistently throughout the build. And one thing I noticed at this stage was I had a very, very faint whisper of metal on metal contact and ended up tracking it down to the front counterweight, just barely catching the inside surface of one of the inner oil passages. I was able to file that down with just a couple of hits with the file. It was barely making contact, and cleaned that up and took care of that. The only really other adjustment I had to make was my thrust bearings. When I installed it on the rear cap and I went to install the rear cap, it was too large straight out of the box, so I just kind of had to work that down until it would fit. I ended up getting it to about 3/1000ths in play altogether, I believe. It was really not that difficult to do. I just had a really flat piece of glass that I used with some really fine sandpaper, worked over it that way, and then came back through and buffed it afterwards, so it was nice and smooth. But came out to around 3/1000ths after that, and everything fit together really, really well. So at this point you can also see a little bit of that black smudge is where I started installing some of the block plugs, and I was using Permatex number 2 just to seal those in place to prevent any kind of weeping. So at this stage of the build I was installing all of the valves, and for this particular project I used a Schneider's modern valve kit. Everything installed absolutely perfectly straight out of the box. I did check each and every valve to make sure that they were concentric to the seats without having to make any adjustments. I did both the poor man's test, where you can kind of just bounce the valve in its seat to make sure that it bounces. And then after lapping them, I did pull them all out and measure the lip. And everything came out exactly as you'd expect. Nice and even across the entire valve surface. So again, very happy with just how easily this thing went together. There was very minimal corrective work that I had to take. You can ignore the bent spring, it's just temporarily holding the oil drive sprocket in place. That does get replaced later on with the Nurex automatic timing system. For tappets I went with single lock, which made it pretty easy to adjust them. It did take a little bit of time getting everything all in sync. To make it easier getting these springs, the retainers, and the keepers installed, I use a combination of both the KD Tools Model A spring compressor and then a really cheap spring compressor that I found on Amazon that looks like a massive C-clamp. And this gave me enough room to get my fat fingers in there to kind of hold the keepers in place as I slowly took tension off the spring. Otherwise, I've used like the fork kind of hook and fork setup that you can kind of get at some of the Model A stores that hooks on the studs for the intake and exhaust manifolds, but I find that I can never quite get the right angle with those, or it just kind of seems to get in the way. But using that combination, it made it a lot easier, where I was able to get my fat fingers in there, hold them in place, slowly let that tension off, and then just let that seat down perfectly each time. So here at this point, I believe I had all the valves adjusted. You can ignore the bent spring that's going to be going away shortly. But I was pretty impressed again at this point how everything just fit together. There was very minimal corrective work that I had to take. I mean, again, building this in my home garage, there was not much that I had to do other than just assemble it. So here I was just continuing with the build. I've got all of the studs installed. I did chase all of those threads when I got it back from cleaning, just to make sure that there was no debris in them and that they were all nice and free. I do have the pistons installed. I did run into a very interesting issue where I ordered a set of Hastings rings for this, and they came all oversized by 20 thousandths, despite being labeled correctly and everything else on the box and both inside on the individual labels. They were all off. Thankfully, I ordered 2 sets. I opened up the second set, which was a different batch number, and they were all perfect. So it just goes to show that when you're building these things or building any engine, don't take anything for granted. Don't just grab something, installing it, thinking it's going to be right out of the box. Be sure to measure everything as you go, because you never know when something weird like that might just pop up and just be out of spec. So thankfully I'd ordered 2, so it didn't slow the build down or anything like that. Here's just another angle of installing a couple more of the components on the outside. I got a brand new oil filler tube installed. As you can see, I've got a socket installed on that front crank pulley there so that I could rotate the engine over, just check everything out, make sure everything was clear, it's fine, make sure there was no binding, anything like that. Everything went together fairly smoothly, no issues. So here I have a few more components installed on the engine. You can see my Nurex timing system installed in place of the bent spring before. I have the head installed, the distributor, the water neck. Everything is torqued down at this point. I did go with a graphite head gasket. Had some weeping issues with some of the other head gaskets. I do like the copper, but every once in a while they've weeped on me as well. So I went with the graphite this time. They seem to seal the best, even though they're not the easiest to change later on. But if I need to cross that road, I will deal with it when it comes up. I'd rather just not have it leaking on me at this stage, and so far it has been fine. Overall, the total build took me 2 days, and that was with a group of people watching, asking questions. I do believe I probably could have finished it in a single day if I wasn't answering questions. Of course, that wouldn't include the time to paint the block, let it dry, getting the block cleaned, that sort of thing. For paint, I did use the Snyder's Antique Green just in the spray cans. I think it took me a can and a half altogether. I primed the block first, and then I just bombed it with the spray cans. That includes the head of the block, the various covers. I did do the flywheel housing, stuff like that as well. So it went a pretty decent far away. It's been holding up extremely well so far. I did the old engine block, which you can see here, in the exact same color, but as we get near towards the end of the build, I've now had the opportunity to build 3 of these, and the one thing that stood out across all the builds has been the consistency. Everything has gone together the exact same. All of my clearances so far have been pretty much the exact same. The only differences I've run into with the blocks have been the thrust washers and just having the clearance of those, which has been something I have expected during the build. So overall, extremely satisfied. I think Terry hit it out of the park with these things, where pretty much anybody, if they just stick to the builder's guide, have a basic mechanical knowledge, can build a quality product at home by themselves without needing to worry about having a specialty shop. So very impressed. So let's get on to the first start. Some specs. It is a Snyder's 6-to-1 head. That surprisingly did come from Snyder's, very flat. It has a Burtz 340 cam in it. Marvel carburetor hanging off on the side. Otherwise, it is a relatively stock build. I do have an oil pressure gauge hiding out down there below. But that's about the only thing externally that should give it away. I have primed the oil system a bit by cranking it without starting it, but we're going to try to give it its first start and see how badly I messed it up. Hopefully nothing burns down or blows up. Let's give it a shot. As you can see, I don't even have my floor in here yet. Some wishful thinking. Alright. Ignition on. Don't think I need some choke. Usually it starts up pretty good and it's pretty warm. So, here we go. Fire it off pretty quick. No abnormal noises. As you can see, since it's just the first start, I do not have the radiator or anything else in here at the moment. We've got oil pressure. Looks like we've got all the oil pressure. 30 pounds cold. Seems really high. I believe these are supposed to be 10 psi per 1,000 RPM. So that'll bleed down a bit. Oh, we got some leaks. I was afraid of that. Alright, I'll have to address some of that. Yeah, sounds pretty smooth, running pretty good. I have to turn it off here before it gets too warm. Here we are on day 2 with the Burtz. Got the idle adjusted just a little bit better. As you can see, I've got the fan on there now, the radiator installed. Started putting together some of the front clip. I do have it idling a bit fast. Again, like I said, I haven't really tuned the idle down quite yet. Just kind of putting it through its paces. I have gone back through and just rechecked the torque on the head. This will probably be one of the first times I'd actually kind of let it warm up a little bit. I think I'm still getting all the oil pressures. And Leonard was nice enough to give me a call yesterday after I emailed him. And I kind of forgot and didn't think about the fact that because I don't have the oil filter on here, this pump is designed for a full flow oil filter system. And where I'm checking it is right off of the pump itself. So I'm seeing pretty much the full pump pressure where I'm at, which explains why it's so high. So here we are, 1,500 miles later. As you can see, the engine is still an engine, still looks pretty clean. I have gotten most of my oil leaks all solved now. The most tricky one was the pressure port right there, where usually you would install your pressure gauge. I do not yet have the adapter to be able to hook my pressure gauge up there. I have been waiting on the Leonard Nettles oil filter adapter kit to be completed. He's getting pretty close on those. I'm pretty excited. So far, Leonard has been absolutely killing it on all of his parts he's making for these things. The oil pump has just been fantastic. So yeah, 1,500 miles later, it's due for an oil change. Now I've been doing them every 500 miles or so. I can probably bump that up to 1,000 without the oil filter now. The last time I did the oil change on it, it came out pretty clean at 500, but I've just been kind of erring on the cautious side. So yeah, these 1,500 miles, they have not been easy miles. I've not just put this on a highway going from here to wherever and knocked out like a 500 miles all at once. Most of these drives have been short little quick trips, whether it's running to the parts store, whether it's running to pick up some food, or even running up to Model A days. That's only 120 miles round trip from here, but it's a lot of back roads, some pretty windy, hilly roads, so a lot of varying speeds, a lot of varying loads. It has really put this engine through its paces in a very short period of time. and it has handled it all phenomenally. I have not had any kind of issues. The vibrations that I had previously with my old block, where the center babbitt had gone out more or less, they're all gone. Even when that engine was at its best, this one with the counterweighted crank in it, it is just smooth. It's still a Model A. You still get the same sound from it. You still have the same performance. You're not winning any drag races. So the heart and soul still feels the same, but it's just comforting knowing that this thing is going to last a long time, that I can put these kind of miles on it and this type of driving without having to be worried about, are my babbitt's going to hold up? Am I going to have to pull the oil pan and pull shims out in the next 1,000 miles or 2,000 miles? It's pretty comforting to know that it's just, I can kind of just perform my regular maintenance now and just let it go and drive it as I want. I mean, it's still a Model A. There's still grease fittings everywhere on this thing, so it is still a bit tedious to kind of go around and grease and oil everything every 500 miles to 1,000 miles. So I mean, you can't get away from all of it, but it's just nice knowing that the engine is one thing I'll not have to worry about anymore. So overall, very pleased. Once again, I just want to thank Leonard Nettles for his fantastic oil pump. He does have a website up now where you can go and see what he's got in stock and order through his website. It's not completely finished yet at the time of recording this. So if you do go there and you see that he is out of stock, or you for some reason can't place an order, don't be alarmed, just give it some time. He should be having his oil filter adapters coming out pretty soon, which will bolt right up. You won't have to modify anything. If they're anything like his oil pump, they'll be fantastic. A big thank you to Terry and John for getting these engines out to everybody. I barely had to wait to get a hold of mine. It went together extremely smoothly. So thank you to those guys. I'm very, very pleased. Looking forward to making another video once I hit 10,000 miles on this thing, and we'll see where it goes from there. So thank you for tuning in, and stay tuned for some more.